Module 3 of Culture, Identity and Tradition. We are more than our names. We are a cultural package. Our identity carries along with it a trail of the socio-cultural and traditional moorings to which we belong. Culture and tradition have evolved over generations from the earliest practices of our common prehistoric ancestors, which cancels out the notion of the superior and inferior cultures. The relationship between differing societies is one of interdependence, egalitarianism, and mutual respect, accepting of differences even while acknowledging them. Identity, culture, and tradition become issues of concern when this equilibrium is established by the encroachment of one culture into the domain of another. When a culture exercises undue power over another, such cultural encroachments have been so rampant that in reality, cultural equilibrium has never been a reality. At one level, these encroachments are productive in that they provide avenues for cross-cultural exchanges. On the other hand, they are ultimately destructive because the dominant culture can greatly impoverish or erase altogether the cultural heritage of the other. Education, language, rituals, practices, and even food and occupation have been used as instruments of oppression and subjugation by alienating people from their indigenous culture and practices. Such has been the case of the native Indians in America and Dalits and Naga tribes in India, among many other such communities. Invariably, literatures of resistance have emerged from these dominated and marginalized cultures. These reactions have assumed three distinct forms: literature of opposition to the dominating culture, literature of the reality of the dominated status, and the literature to reclaim and reinforce native culture. Examples of all three approaches have been compiled in this module. Care has been taken to select texts from underrepresented cultures whose voices and stories have not received the attention they deserve. The Poisoned Bread, Bantu Madhav. Bantu Madhav, 1927 to 1997, was a Dalit short story writer from Mahar community in Maharashtra and a Buddhist convert. He wrote extensively during the 1940s to 1950s. He was also instrumental in founding the Little Magazine movement, which blended modernism and the Dalit movement in Marathi literature along with Baburao Bagul and Shankarao Kharat. Bantu Madhav was also a leading writer of Prabuddha Bharat and Dharmayana. The Poisoned Bread is a short story of an awakened but suppressed Dalit consciousness and presents dissenting voices against upper caste domination and exploitation. It shows how education has empowered a new generation of Dalits to reclaim their legitimate space in a caste-ridden society that continues to diminish them. Mahadeva, indifferent to custom, addresses the upper caste landlord Bapu Patil as Patil and despises his grandfather's subservience to him. Patil, on his part, continues to humiliate the two. They are denied their just wages or their meagre share of corn, forced in the end to feed on stale, dung-smeared and poisoned bread. While this degradation ultimately takes the life of the grandfather, he dies with the realization that his true Dalit identity is not one of slavishness but of reclaiming his rights as a human being. This struggle is the legacy he leaves for his grandson Madeva, invoking the future of Dalit movement. The poisoned bread. Come harvest time with everyone busy winnowing and sifting. When the birds whir in the sky, my heart bleeds like a wounded bird as I recall the bygone harvest of 12 years ago. When I had gone to meet my grandfather, Yetelya Aja to us at Kupat. As usual, Grandpa Yetalya took me with him as he went out looking for a job of winnowing and treading out the corn at the threshing floor. As a matter of fact, he intended to beg a cucumber or a marrow or a few peanuts, if possible, at one of the farms for me. And by taking me along to assist him, he hoped to get a slightly larger share of corn and a few ears of jowar for us. We stopped at a threshing floor. There, tidying a pile of disheveled ears of corn, was Bapu Patil. Grandpa approached Patil and saluted him with a johar. Acknowledging Grandpa's salute like a swaggering Maharaja, Bapu Patil said coolly, "What brings you here at such an early hour? Hope you haven't come here with your mind set on evil, for don't they see an encounter with a Mahar in the morning and you are doomed for good." Grandpa displayed no reaction to Bapu Patel's insolence. On the contrary, he meekly and with utmost respect said to Patil, "Why do you say that, Anna? I am your slave. I have come to you on purpose on hearing of the operations at your threshing floor. My lord is our bread giver and we find it a privilege to beg for our share of corn, master. I am your begging Mahar and I feel proud to be so." But Grandpa's humility had the reverse effect on Bapu Patil, who turned more sarcastic. "Don't give me that line. You are no longer the Mahar Mangs of the good old days. To beg for your share of the corn, you are now Harijans. You have even started claiming equality. So I was told, eating and drinking with us at the city hotels. So there remains absolutely no difference between us, does there? Now that you are our peers, tell me, why do you still beg for a share of the corn?" And yet, I could see no adverse effect of Bapu's taunt on Grandpa. In fact, I discerned a sense of pride in him as he straightened himself and said, "How could you say that, Anna? This Yetelya is certainly not one of those claiming equality. How can one, in that case, account for God's creating religion and the castes? Come on, don't you know that the rain god got enraged because you, the Mahars and monks, have profaned religion and abandoning caste, have defiled Lord Vithoba of Pandarpur? How else can you account for the drying up of Chandrabhaga river?" Bapu Patil resaid to justify his insults. I could take it no more. I felt my cheeks burning, but I quelled my temper and, cutting Bapu Patil short in the middle of his fiery tirade, burst out, "Patil, will you kindly tell me what you mean when you accuse us of forgetting religion abandoning our caste and of polluting God? If a religion can't tolerate one human being treating another simply as a human being, what's the use of such an inhuman religion? And if our mere touch pollutes the gods, why were the Mahas and monks created at all? And who, may I know, who indeed created them? And would you please tell me the name of the god whom the Mahas and monks can claim as their own? My retort made Bapu Patil wild. I would address him simply as Patil, whereas the rest of our clan call him Anna or elder brother. And to top it all, a Maha was answering him back. Violent anger shook him and he screamed at me. Look at the snot-nosed brat. He can't even keep his nose clean and yet has the audacity to talk back to me. Yatelya, who's good for nothing, whelp have you brought with you? The violent rage of Bapu Patil sent Grandpa into a panic, knowing too well that in a fit of temper, Bapu Patil was capable even of committing murder. He started shaking violently. In a voice stricken with fear and in the humblest of tones, therefore, Grandpa replied, "He is my eldest daughter's son from Sankalwadi. He is too young to know how to speak to his elders. He is city bred and has learned to read and write. Need he be so impudent just because he knows how to read and write? And mind you, even if a Maha or man gets educated, no one will ever call him a Brahmin. A Maha is a Maha, even he passes LLB and becomes a barrister. You should know the story of Chokha Mela. Was he let into the temple by Vithoba of Pandharpur? Why, I ask you, has Chokha Mela been kept at the foot of the temple? One should always keep to one's own position. Having been brought up in the city of Sankhli, I was a little bolder than the rest of my clan, so I said to Patel, "What's this position you are talking about, Patil, and whose position?" At my retort, Patil exploded. "Look here, boy, simple, because you have had a little education. Don't think you can teach me. You should know that God intended to have a definite hierarchy when He created the Brahmin, the Maratha, the fisherman, the weaver, the Mahar monk, the Dor, and the cobbler in that order. Everyone must abide by this scheme and accordingly put every man in his proper place. As they wisely say, a chapel is never worshipped in the place of God, is it?" He paused. I was determined to give tit for tat. "So you think you can treat us like your footwear? But are we really like that? Aren't we also made of the same flesh and blood as the rest of you? We too are born after 9 months in our mother's womb. Isn't it logical then?" I entered rhetorically that basically there's hardly any difference between us. Yatelya, have you come here to walk or to quarrel with me? If you and your grandson are so well off, why did you come to me to beg? Get lost. A little learning doesn't entitle that boy to teach me. Understand? At this, Grandpa Yatelya literally fell at the feet of Bapu Patil and appealed to him with tears in his eyes. Don't say that, please. He's a child, just a boy. Please don't take him seriously. He hasn't seen enough of the world and doesn't know how to speak to his elders." And then turning to me, he chided, "Madhava, don't just stand there gaping at Anna. Pick up that grubbing hoe and get to work." I felt helpless and dumbfounded as he handed me the hoe. The next moment I set to work with my head bent low, moving the grubbing hoe in the heap of corn. Somehow I managed to suppress my anger. Bapu Patil was standing close by watching us for some time. After a while he left, but not before warning us. Finish the job before I return from breakfast. We will take the bullocks out for the winnowing in the evening. Hurry up. Don't you know you have to work hard if you want your share of corn? Grandpa and me yoked ourselves together and set upon the work at hand. Halfway through, Grandpa said that he would go to Grandpa Patil's threshing floor to fetch a tripod and a few measures of corn, and I was left alone to clean up. I was working hard at the threshing floor. The red, hot sun was scorching. Exhaustion and the unbearable heat of the sun made me sweat profusely all over. I was famished, but Grandpa had still not returned, and I was far from the end. Wild ideas began to cook in the heated cauldron of my brain. I was worried at the thought of Bapu Patel turning up suddenly and finding the job unfinished, and since I had already roused his anger, I thought I was going to be easy prey. Before the thought had faded, Bapu Patel, now accompanied by Tuka MacDoom, arrived. I was scared stiff. I was lagging behind. There was no trace of Grandpa yet, and here stood my tormentor. You, grandson of Yetalya, has your grandfather dropped dead? Shouted Bapu Patel. He is gone to Grandpa Patel's farm to fetch a tripod. I faltered, already frightened. At that, Bapu Patel was extremely furious and started abusing Grandpa in the most humiliating terms. Has he gone to fetch the tripod or to war with his wife? Tuka MacDoom did his faithful bit by aggravating the matter. All these Mahars are a loosey lot. You will never find them at their work. These good-for-nothing fellows only know to while away their time. I could control myself no more, and yet I found myself pleading before Bapu Patel. Why do you abuse him? Grandpa will be here soon. Annoyingly, I had added fuel to the fire, for the inflamed Patel was now screaming with biting sarcasm. So you don't want me to abuse your grandfather? Should I then touch his feet? And turning to Tuka MacDoom, he said, I have been watching this chap since morning. This brat of a Maha has been talking back. No use telling me, Anna. Just give me a hard kick in the loins. He deserves nothing better. Tuka MacDoom incited him. Presently Grandpa arrived, running like mad. His very appearance was enough for Bapu Patel to let loose his volley of abuse. I say, Yetalya, were you assigned to do a job or to play hide and seek? It's past noon now, and this grandson of yours has only been shuffling weeds. Stop working this instant at the threshing floor. I shall manage it myself. Get up, I will give you nothing. Get up. Don't do a harsh thing like that, Anna. You can kick us if you like, but please don't starve us. Grandpa pleaded with tears in his eyes, but the stone-hearted Patel was not moved. We eventually finished the assigned job, yoked the bullocks and moved them onto the threshing floor. But after we had toiled throughout the day, Bapu Patel did not give Grandpa even a few measures of jowar. Grandpa was crestfallen, dejected. As we felt the threshing floor, however, Grandpa could not fail to notice the pen wore steel. Rancid pieces of bread lay scattered on the ground in front of the oxen. It's rightly said that as the comer has his eye on the chapel, so does the mahar on stale bread. Flies were swarming over the mouldering crops, which had turned green and foul. Grandpa begged Bapu Patel for those crumbs. The oxen seems to have refused to eat them. They were smeared with dung and urine. Grandpa collected them all happily and put them neatly into his sackcloth, and he felt pleased but now before blessing Patel. I followed him with my head hung low. There was a heavy silence between us. Finally, breaking it, Grandpa said, "The landlord got angry with me because of you, Madheva. I had thought that having toiled the whole day we would get a larger measure of corn. Now, what shall we have for supper?" "We will gulp down the crumbs you collected. Haven't we got those rotten pieces as a reward for laboring all day long? A good exchange indeed. Are we any better than cats or dogs? Throw a few crumbs at us and we are happy," I mocked. "You said it," Grandpa explained. "Madheva, will the Mahars and Mangs never be happy? What a humiliating life we live! Do you think I feel happy about being oppressed by the landlords and the rest of the villagers? I too want to retaliate and have a good fight for the humiliation and injustice they have been piling upon us. But, my boy, I am helpless. I see no end to this suffering," lamented Grandpa. "But why should it go on? Even a lion locked in a cage all his life forgets how to hunt. This hereditary land right has trapped us Mahars for good. How can we dream of doing business independently since we have been fed all our lives on the charity of others? What achievement can we ever boast of? All that comes from begging is more begging." As I erupted spiritually, filled with disgust, Grandpa Yetalia stood gaping at me, stunned. I could see the admiration he felt for me. He seemed to be enveloped by the impenetrable darkness on all sides. After a while, he said, "Madheva, I fully agree with what you say, but how does one escape from the fix of the hereditary holding?" "By abandoning it. There is no alternative," I replied immediately. He walked in silence for a few moments. He looked as if he were lost in deep thought. Suddenly he stopped and turning to me asked, "How will the Mahars survive if they abandon the land right? Thanks to it, we can at least get these stale crumbs. Only this way can I approach the landlord and beg for bread as my right. But if that too is gone, what are we left with?" When I said we should abandon the land right, I didn't mean we should give it up literally, but we must stop begging under the pretext that we are getting our rightful share of corn. And instead of enslaving ourselves to lifelong labor in exchange for that right, we must free ourselves from the land bondage and learn to live independently with a sense of pride. We Mahars have been misled by the false notion of the land right, taking it as a rightful favor to beg for bread as long as we live. We forget all the while that the crumbs they give us make us slaves. I suddenly stopped talking as we approached home. "You are right, my boy. I am convinced. You have touched my heart," said Grandpa and threw a few crumbs from his sack to the dog squatting opposite our house. Grandma came rushing out of the house and shouted at Grandpa, "Have you gone mad? If you give all the food to the dogs, what shall we eat?" She collected all the pieces thrown before the dogs and cleaned the mud off them. She then mixed them with dilly and cooked them for supper. At night, everyone at home greedily hogged the stuff. With that heavy meal, we fell asleep. The next morning, we woke up to the sound of Grandpa writhing in agony like a poisoned dog. He was vomiting and purging too. All the neighbors huddled together and started suggesting various types of remedies. I was sitting helplessly by Grandpa's bed, confused. But even at that time, in spite of myself, I could visualize the entire predicament of the Mahar caste. In those frenzied moments, I thought I saw the crumpling, mild wet pieces of bread smeared with drunken urine taken from Bapu Patel's cow pen floating before my eyes. The share of corn which Grandpa always took as his rightful dole from Bapu Patel, I was convinced beyond doubt, had caused the vomiting and dysentery. He seemed to have taken to heart the whole episode at Patel's threshing floor. Sitting by the side of his bed, shedding tears, I felt benumbed and despondent. My mind was wailing in agony. When shall the meek and humble people of my community be uplifted? And when shall they be treated like human beings? When? In the meantime, my maternal uncle had brought a doctor all the way from Sankli. Examining Grandpa, the doctor said, "What did he eat last night?" I went into the kitchen and brought the earthen pot in which the rancid crumbs of bread mixed with dilly had been cooked. Putting it in front of the doctor, I said, "These are 4-day-old stale and mouldering pieces of bread cooked with dilly. This is what he ate last night." The doctor looked surprised as he said, "That's it. The mold in the stuff created a toxin. That toxin must have caused his dysentery. It's a serious case." Grandpa showed great amazement as he lay in bed. "What? You say the crumbs had turned to poison?" "It was in fact poison? Poisoned bread? Really poison?" Grandpa lost hope. The dysentery and the vomiting had almost killed him, and the doctor's diagnosis was the last straw. None of the medicines suggested by the doctor proved effective, and we became helpless. Seeing him in agony, I broke down. I could barely speak to Grandpa. "Grandpa, Grandpa, please say something to me," I said. Grandma was crying as well, and Uncle too started sobbing. Mustering all his strength and with tremendous willpower, Grandpa uttered a few words. "Madheva, don't weep, my boy. I am an old thing now, and being so old, I may stop breathing any movement. What can I say to you now? I can say only, never depend on the age-old bread associated with our caste. Get as much education as you can. Take away this accursed bread from the mouths of the Mahars. This poisonous bread will finally kill the very humanness of man." There he stopped abruptly, turned his face away, and closed his eyes forever. Grandma was the first to react and broke into a loud wail. My aunt joined her, and soon everyone had joined in a deafening lament. The ominous lapwings too were making shrill and piercing notes in the sky. I was numb. Everything felt numb. Amidst of the commotion, I could still hear Grandpa's last words. "This poisonous bread will finally kill the very humanness of man." The recollection of these words put out my sorrow at the loss of my beloved Ajah. Instead, I was inflamed by overwhelming fury and disgust that made me want to retaliate, and therefore, when it is harvest time, with everyone busy winnowing and sifting, and the birds whirl in the sky, my heart bleeds like a wounded bird, and I recall that bygone harvest. 12 years old now, originally translated from the Maratha by Ramesh Niyat.
A trip westward, Sitkalasa. Sirkilasa was an American writer, editor, musician, teacher, and political activist. Her birth name was Gertrude Simmons Bonin, and she was born on the Yankton Sioux Reservation in South Dakota, US. She adopted the name Sitkalasa in her teens. Sitkalasa lived within the Sioux Reservation until 1884, when the Quaker missionaries recruited her and other students for a boarding school for the Indians in Wabash, Indiana. She attended Elham College in Richmond and became a music teacher at the Pennsylvania Castle Indian Industrial School. She published several short stories and autobiographical essays in the Atlantic Monthly and Harper's Monthly under her name Sitkalasa. Most of her stories are drawn from her struggle to retain her cultural identity against the dominant Anglo-American culture. In 1900, she went back to the Yankton Reservation to recruit students. She collected stories from Native Americans on the reservation and published them in the Old Indian Legends. In 1902, she married Captain Raymond Tailfaced Bonin, who was half Euro-American and half Sioux, and they moved to the reservation in Utah. She collaborated on the music for the Sundance Opera, the first opera to be co-authored by a Native American. Under the name Gertrude Bonin, she co-authored the book Oklahoma's Poor Rich Indians, an argy of gift and exploitation of the 5 civilized tribes legalized robbery, which exposed the mistreatment of Native Americans in Oklahoma. She advocated citizenship rights, better educational opportunities, improved health care, and recognition and preservation of Native American culture. The current passage is taken from the American Indian Stories, where Sitkalasa recounts her journey to her home in the Yankton Indian Reservation. The passage, A Trip Westward, is taken from the chapter An Indian Teacher Among Indians. She reaches home after a long journey through the reservation and is apprehensive of meeting her mother after a long absence. To her dismay and chagrin, she finds that her mother's house is a dilapidated state, and her brother Dowey, a government clerk, has lost his job to a white man, and that white settlers are occupying land allotted to the Yankton, Dakota, under the Dowey's Act of 1877. A Trip Westward. The intense heat and the sticky car smoke that followed my homeward trail did not noticeably restore my vitality. Hour after hour, I gazed upon the country which was receding rapidly from me. I noticed the gradual expansion of the horizon as we emerged out of the forest into the plains. The great high buildings, whose towers overlooked the dense woodlands and whose gigantic clusters formed large cities, diminished together with the groves until only little log cabins lay snugly in the bosom of the vast prairie. The cloud shadows which drifted about on the waving yellow of the long dried grasses thrilled me like the meeting of old friends. At a small station consisting of a single frame house with a rickety boardwalk around it, I alighted from the iron horse, just 30 miles away from my mother and my brother Dowey. A strong hot wind seemed determined to blow my hat off and return me to olden days when I roamed bareheaded over the hills. After the puffing engine of my train was gone, I stood on the platform in deep solitude. In the distance I saw the gently rolling land leaping up into the bare hills. At their bases a broad grey road was winding itself round above them until it came by the station. Among these hills I rode in a light conveyance with a trusty driver. All the morning I looked about me, recognizing old familiar skylines of rugged bluffs and round-topped hills. By the roadside I caught glimpses of various plants whose sweet roots were delicacies among my people. When I saw the first cone-shaped wigwam, I could not help uttering an exclamation which caused my driver a sudden jump out of his drowsy nodding. At noon, as we drove through the eastern edge of the reservation, I grew very impatient and restless. Constantly I wondered what my mother would say upon seeing her little daughter grown tall. I had not written her the day of my arrival, thinking I would surprise her. Crossing a ravine thicketed with low shrubs and plum bushes, we approached a large yellow acre of wild sunflowers. Just beyond this nature's garden, we drove near my mother's cottage. Close by the log cabin stood a little canvas covered wigwam. The driver stopped in front of the open door, and in a long moment my mother appeared at the threshold. My mother had never gone to school, and though she meant always to give up her own customs for such of the white man's ways as pleased her, she made only compromises. Her two windows, directly opposite each other, she curtained with a pink flowered print. The naked loaves were unstained and rudely carved with the axe so as to fit into one another. The sod roof was trying to boast of tiny sunflowers, the seeds of which had probably been planted by the constant wind. As I leaned my head against the logs, I discovered a peculiar odor that I could not forget. The rains had soaked the earth and roof so that the smell of damp clay was but the natural breath of such a dwelling. Mother, why was not your house cemented? Do you have no interest in a more comfortable shelter? I asked, when the apparent inconvenience of her home seemed to suggest indifference on her part. You forget, my child, that I am now old, and I do not work with beads any more. Your brother Davy, too, has lost his position, and we are left without any means to buy even a morsel of food, she replied. Davy was a government clerk in our reservation when I last heard from him. I was surprised upon hearing what my mother said concerning his lack of employment. Seeing the puzzled expression on my face, she continued, Davy, has he not told you that the great father at Washington sent a white son to take your brother's pen from him? Since then, Davy was not been able to make use of the education the Eastern school has given him. I found no words with which to answer satisfactorily. I found no reason with which to cool my inflamed feelings. The Potmaker, Temsula Au. Temsula Au is a renowned poet, short story writer, and ethnographer. She retired as professor of English from Northeastern Hill University, Shillong. Recognized as one of the major literary voices not only of Nagaland, her home state, but of Northeast India, she has been awarded the Padma Shri, Meghalaya Governor's Gold Medal, and a Sahitya Akademi Award. Her literary output includes 5 anthologies of poetry, songs that tell, songs that try to say, songs of many moods, songs from here and there, and songs from the other life. She has also published 2 short story collections, These Hills Called Home, Stories from a War Zone, and a Labam of My Head, in addition to her treatise on Ao Naga oral traditions. The story, The Potmaker, included in Temsula anthologies, These Hills Called Home, highlights the formative influence of tribal tradition and customs on an individual and her aspirations. The indigenous beliefs, cultural and traditional practices, and systems of tribal societies tend more to the interest of the community as a whole, sometimes against individual pursuits. The Potmaker is set in such a Naga tribal community. Scintilla's mother, Aranla, is reluctant to pass on the traditional knowledge and craft of pottery to her daughter. Scintilla, however, is determined to become a potmaker and seeks the assistance of the elder women of the tribe. The village council sides with the aspirations of the girl, and Aranla is forced to teach her daughter her craft. The story reiterates tribal value systems and holds the interest of the community over that of the individual member and the power of tradition in defining their lives. The Potmaker. Ever since Scintilla had become old enough to accompany her mother to the fields and forest, she began to dream of becoming a potmaker like her mother and grandmother. Her mother tried to make her learn weaving, a skill highly valued as an asset in any girl, but she only wanted to make pots, and lots of them of various sizes and shapes. On days when Scintilla managed to stay at home, while her parents and other elders went to the fields, She sought out the women who were expert potters and requested to be taught the skills. At first, they were amused by the little girl's insistence. They thought that she would soon outgrow her childish fascination for the craft. They told her that it was a back-breaking work and was often frustrating, especially when a sudden shower ruined weeks of labor, and the pots drying in the sun were destroyed by the rain. Some batches might be completely ruined if the firing in the makeshift kiln was not done properly. Out of 100 pots, they told her, only 50 or so would turn out well enough to fetch a good price. The rest would either have to be used at home for various purposes or given away. They asked her, had she not heard her mother and grandmother ever complain of these difficulties? She said yes, but she wanted to be a potter and a better pot maker than anyone in the village, and when she made pots, she told them she would sell every single one of them. The earthen pots made in this village were famous all over the region, and people from far off villages and even from other tribes came to either buy or barter the pots. As it happens in any small community where everyone knows everyone else, the little girl's obsession with pottery became known, and soon the mother came to hear of her daughter's visits to these pot makers. She did not say anything to the girl at first. She decided to wait and see how serious the girl was about. She pretended that she did not know where her daughter went on the days that she was left in the village to look after her younger brother. When Scintilla visited the old woman, she would strap the baby, who was 10 months old, to her back with a cloth and labor up the steep hill to reach their workshed. She would carry some cooked rice in a leaf packet with her on these trips. When her baby brother becomes hungry, she would chew some of it, and once it was soft, she would feed it to the baby. Then she would sing a lullaby to put him to sleep while she watched the women work intently. One of the old women sang beautiful folk songs while working, but when something went wrong, she would substitute the words of the song to suit her anger and frustration, which made everyone else laugh. Scintilla enjoyed being there, but by late afternoon she had to leave them. So she would gently pick her brother up from where he slept, and swinging him deftly onto her back, would walk home quickly so that when her mother returned from the fields, they would be at home. Scintilla's regular visits to the old potmaker's shed became a topic of the village gossip. People started asking why she had to go elsewhere to learn potmaking when her own mother Aranella and grandmother were renowned potmakers. Why was the mother refusing to teach her daughter the skill which was her birthright? If all potmakers followed suit, then there would be no expert potters to take their place, and the village would lose their coveted status. Didn't Aranella know that in the days of head hunting, this village was spared many times because of the skilled potmakers? As days went by, the gossip became open debate, and finally one day, Scintilla's father, whose name was Mezoba, was summoned by the village council and asked to explain why his daughter was making regular trips to the old potmaker's shed to learn the craft, and more importantly, why was Aranella refusing to pass on her skills to her daughter? Mezoba was caught in a dangerous situation. If he told them that his wife had said about potmaking and that she wanted their daughter to learn another craft like weaving, they would immediately fine her for going against tradition. On the other hand, if he denied knowledge of his daughter's clandestine visits, they would not believe him and ridicule him for being an incompetent husband and father, and not just that, he too would be fined. He pondered over their query for a while and replied in a humble tone, "Uncles and elder brothers, I admit that we have all along known about Scintilla's visit to the old ladies and why she loves going there. She told us that a particular lady sings beautiful lullabies and gives her sweet potatoes every time she sings with her. Her mother has never refused to teach her how to make pots. It is only that she wanted her to grow a little bigger and stronger after her illness before we took her to the Lithu to the river bank to dig the clay. In fact, I have ordered a small digging dowel for Scintilla at the blacksmith's just yesterday. So what has been circulated by the idle mouths is not really true. You will soon see that Scintilla will start making the best pots in the village. What Mesoba blurted out to the elders was impromptu. It was a desperate attempt to avert their ire, but luckily for him, what he said did have a ring of truth. There indeed was a noted folk singer among the old potmakers who sang while she worked, and who had given a sweet potato to the little girl one day. Scintilla had indeed fallen sick just recently, and she had indeed placed an order for a small davo meant, not for Scintilla of course, but for his wife to use in the kitchen garden. After listening to Mesoba's explanation, the elders decided that there was no cause to take any drastic action against him, and yet they let him go, cautioning him to remind his wife that it was her duty to train her daughter in the skills that were handed down from generation to generation for the good of the entire village. They also told him that skills such as pottery, which not only catered to the everyday needs of the people, but also symbolized the tradition and history of the community, did not belong to any one individual. That experts were obliged to pass on their skills not only to their own children, but also to anyone who wished to learn. Think of the teaching that goes in the moorings, the dormitories for young men, which is our way of educating our youngsters in the requisite skill for survival. In the same way, mothers are to educate their daughters in the skills meant for women. Your wife should be willing to pass on the gift to her daughter. And ominously they added, anyone refusing to do so will be considered an enemy of the village. That evening, Mesoba went home with a heavy heart, with this rude reminder of how things were with them in the tightly knit community of the village. His wife's arguments did make practical sense, but he could not ignore the opinions of the village council, which always put the collective good above individual interest. And if he wished to continue living peacefully in the village, he, or rather Aranala, would have to set her personal objections aside and do what was expected of her. They talked this over late into the night and decided that from now on Scintilla would not be left in the village to babysit her brother, but would accompany them to the fields. The following year, Scintilla was taken by her mother to Lithu, whether the grey and red clay was available. She was taught how to dig the clay with her tool, how to load the clay onto her carrying basket, and how to soak it in the trough in the workshed before stuffing it into the bamboo cylinder in the right proportion, and how to pound it. She was a quick learner and did not mind working hard to achieve the right consistency and color in the clay to form a sort of malleable dough. But when she tried her hand at the shaping the lump into the pot, she became up against a wall. She could not hold the lump of dough on her thigh properly. As she tried to hold it, her muddy hand kept slipping even before the spatula in the right hand could start tapping the dough into shape. The first attempts were disastrous, and Scintilla cried her heart out at her incompetence. However, she persisted and would not admit defeat. The mother simply sat in a corner and watched her try again and again to transform the clay into a pot. Even if Scintilla did something incorrectly in the process, her mother kept silent. Scintilla would send appealing looks towards her mother, who coolly refused to guide her. The whole process seemed to have become a contest of wills, where the mother seemed to thwart her despairing daughter's every attempt to create the slightest semblance of a pot out of the recurrent clay. When Scintilla hung her head in shame and frustration, the mother pushed her daughter off from the low stool and take over, wielding the spatula expertly over the clay that she held firmly on her thigh, and glowed when the lump was transferred into a beautiful plot. Do you think that you can ever make anything like this? She would ask spitefully. The sessions continued for almost a year, but throughout this period, Cinderella began to feel so inadequate before her mother's expertise and open disdain that she was unable to learn anything from her. It appeared to Cinderella that her mother's antipathy to her learning the art was putting a jinx on every lump of clay that she touched. Instead of her dream pots, she could produce only misshapen parodies. The next year, Cinderella attained puberty and was required, according to custom, to spend the nights in one of the girls' dormitories. This particular dormitory was supervised by a kind middle aged widow. Like everyone else in the village, she too had heard of the discord in Cinderella's family concerning her attempts at pot making. Also, the fraud situation between the mother and the daughter had become public knowledge. The older woman took to the serious young girl immediately and resolved to help her in every possible way so that the girl could fulfill her dream of becoming a good pot maker. She began to look for an opportunity to be alone with Cinderella so that they could talk freely. But in a dormitory housing almost 20 girls every night, this was not easy to do. However, an opportunity soon presented itself. One evening, it was announced that a renowned singer was coming with his choir to sing for the entire village in the village common. Learning that the lead singer was a handsome man with many other young men in his group, every girl from the dormitory eagerly sought permission from Onula or auntie to go and listen to them sing. Only Cinderella said that she would stay back because she was not feeling well. In fact, she had been looking for a quiet opportunity to practice her art alone and had smuggled some clay from her mother's workshed for this purpose. It was as if heaven had arranged for the girl and Onula to come together. After all the girls had left, Cinderella quietly took out the clay and the tools from her basket and sat down in a darkened corner to try once again to make a pot. At first, she wielded the spatula tentatively for fear of waking Onula, who she thought was asleep in her room at the rear of the dormitory. On the contrary, the older woman was watching the young girl's clumsy efforts with sympathy. She decided to wait for some time before intervening. She noticed that Cinderella was too tense, the left hand held inside the damp clay was too stiff, and her right hand was not moving fast enough with the spatula on the outside of the lump. As a result, the rhythm between the two was all wrong, and the clay seemed unable or unwilling to yield to the right shape. Wearily, Cinderella let the misshapen lump fall flat on the ground. The older woman went over and gently asked the frightened girl what she was doing with the clay. Cinderella did not reply, but lowered her head and began to cry silently. Onula put her arms around Cinderella. "Don't worry, little one," she said. "I shall teach you how to make a perfect pot. Come, watch how I sit on the stool, holding my thigh muscles taut, and make sure to use sacking to cover the thigh so that the lump does not slip. When you dip your hand in water before slipping it into the clay, make sure it is not too wet. Hold the spatula toward your body and tap gently like this. But most important of all, make sure that the tapping is in rhythm with your left hand rotating inside the clay." Cinderella watched raptly as Onula fashioned a beautiful pot and then asked her to try. Cinderella took another lump of clay, and with a confidence she has never felt before, she started to make a pot in a way she had just observed Onula fashion the clay. As she rotated the lump in her left hand and began tapping on the clay as instructed, she was exhilarated beyond words. She was finally making a real pot. When it was done, she sat there admiring her work, but was soon jolted out of her euphoria when Onula remarked, "The mouth of the pot is all wrong." Cinderella looked and saw that indeed, Where there should have been a gradual tapering of the mold to form a neck like opening, her pot resembled a wide chasm. She looked at Onla in frustration, who only smiled and said, "Enough for one evening. The others will soon be back, and we must keep this to ourselves. When you work with your mother next time, watch her carefully when she is shaping the mouth of the pot. You are a quick learner, and you will do well, but do not bring your work here any more. It is not from me that you should receive this knowledge. Your mother has to pass it on to you. Remember what the village council has ruled." Cinderella looked at Onula, puzzled, but silently collected her tools and the pot that she has made that night and hid them in her basket. The next morning, before anyone else was awake, she hoisted the basket onto her head and started her home. But before reaching the house, she veered off into the path leading to the village well and hid her pot in a clump of bushes growing nearby. The next time Cinderella sat with her mother to make pots, she observed how her mother held the left hand and the spatula, how she slackened the rhythm when fashioning the mouth of the pots, and how a strip of elongated clay was added to the mouth to make the rim. She noticed her mother looking quizzically at her when she caught her paying attention to such details. Then, early one bright sunny day, Aranla told her daughter that they should try to make as many pots as they could, for they might not have enough days of sunshine to dry them. So they went to the shed and began to make pots. As expected, mother completed a batch quickly and asked Cinderella to take cover from her, complaining of a headache and a sore back, telling the daughter to try and make as many pots as she could. Cinderella was surprised at her mother's assumption that she could make a decent pot at all, and found it odd that her mother did not stay back to gloat over yet another failure. With mixed feelings, she reluctantly slid onto the wooden stool and, taking a lump of clay dough, positioned it firmly on her sack-covered thigh. She dipped her left hand in water and carefully inserted it into the clay. Then she took hold of the spatula and lifted it to start beating the dough to give it the required shape. As she lifted the implement for the first tap, she felt as if another pair of hands had taken over and were directing her movements. As though in a trance, she began to beat the dough in perfect coordination with her rotating left hand. The clay seemed to transform itself into another shape, and before long she realized that the pot was ready. She sat there transfixed at her own ability, wondering at the dexterity with which her hands had moved as in unison with her quickening heartbeat. The moment was almost epiphanic. She, Cinderella, who had suffered so much humiliation in her mother's presence for failing to master a simple craft, had now created a miracle. After a while, she gently lowered the pot and started giving the finishing touches to the neck. When it was completed, she set it aside, separate from the ones her mother had made. She started on the next one, and like a sprinter who had suddenly found her momentum, she continued making pot after pot with the same speed and dexterity that she had noticed in her mother's hands. Finally, when she looked at her row of pots, she saw that she had made just one short of her mother's tally. She realized that it was almost midday, and being exhausted from the labor, she continued to sit on the stool and wait for her mother's return. She sat there for a long time, past the hour for the midday meal. She was beginning to feel very hungry, so she decided to go into the house and ask her mother to eat with her, so that she could get an opportunity to tell her about the extraordinary thing what had happened to her. But when she reached the threshold of the outer room, where, as in every house, the firewood was stacked, and where rice was husked, and where the chickens slept at night, a terrible scene awaited her. She found her mother slumped over the low barrier, separating this room from the main one, as if she was still trying to cross over. Her mother's supati had come unstuck in the fall, and a white thigh was visible even from the street door. Cinderella quickly ran forward and carefully retied Supati to hide her mother's nakedness. Only after that she bent low near her mother's mouth to see if she was breathing. She was not. Instead, there was a dry streak where the saliva had dripped. Her mouth was agape as if she was trying to call out. Straightening up, Cinderella ran towards the village common where she knew that her day's sentries would be seated around a fire smoking and drinking black tea. When they heard the news, they all rushed to the house, carried the inert body inside, and laid it on a pallet beside a fireplace. One of the sentries was hurriedly dispatched to carry the news to Mesoba and to summon all the relatives from their fields. Cinderella crouched in a corner, dry-eyed and speechless. Throughout the wake that night, she was seated by her mother's body, muttering to herself. She stayed like that all night, refusing food or drink, and not going out even once to obey nature's call. When the body was being carried out of the house the next morning, she ran after it shouting, "Mother, I did not wish it to happen this way. It simply came to me. Please forgive me." Those who heard her speak did not understand what she meant. They simply thought that she was distraught with grief and did not know what she was saying. But there was one among the mourners who understood, Onula. Though she did not know exactly what had happened the day before, she intuitively sensed that something momentous had transformed both mother and daughter as life's appointed hour on that fateful day. On her way back to her own house, she noticed that the door of the workshed was slightly ajar. Out of curiosity, she stepped inside and stopped in her tracks. Two neat rows of newly made pots stood side by side. Moving closer, she tried to distinguish one batch from the other to determine if it was the handiwork of just one or if a second pair of hands rotated the clay duff and swayed the spatula to create the two separate batches. She could find nothing to tell one batch from the other. She tried hard to reconstruct what might have happened. It could not be the mother's work alone, because Cinderella said that she went back to the house much before the midday hour, and it could not be Cinderella's work alone because she was too young and inexperienced yet to accomplish this even in 2 days. But if both mother and daughter was involved in turning out these pots, was it possible to differentiate between the two batches? Onla stood there for a long time as if trying to absorb a new phenomenon. When she came out of the shed, she had a dazed look on her face and seemed to falter in her gait. Slowly, she walked away from this place of wonder as she reconsidered it to be, because she believed that she had just witnessed a profound revelation in the two batches of still moist pots standing side by side in perfect symmetry inside the shed. A new pot maker was born.